Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from our various quarantine zones in our various areas of Brooklyn. And as always, trying to push for that real solidarity. I'm Michael Brooks, along with super producer Matt Luck.
Hello, everybody.
Economic theorist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, William Shaki of Africa is a Country. We're talking about his great piece, The Class Character of Police Violence, the global implications of Black Lives Matter, the legacy and governing record of the post-liberation African National Congress. Then Ronan Burtenshaw, he's the editor of the Tribune. We're going to be talking about, actually, we recorded this about an hour and a half ago, what happened these last 10 years? Syriza, Podemos, Sanders, Corbyn. What's possible now? What do we have left to learn? And the strategy for a class-based politics. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice, folks. We've got a gem. What's in the gem, David?
We're talking about how essential workers should be able to choose their own fate when it comes to exposing themselves to the coronavirus. How they need to be paid a hell of a lot more.
Indeed. Ben Burgess with a debunked Cato Institute is trying to claim a history in civil rights. Okay. We'll be talking about that. I'm also going to be talking about what absolutely are concentration camps and repression of the Uyghurs in China. And also a broader and much more challenging conversation in many respects, how to actually discuss and analyze China in a smart, integrated way that acknowledges all variables and moves beyond simply skirting around for Wikipedia articles, but trying to do actual analysis. Talk about that later as well. We've also got to look at John Bolton, warmonger, and his, well, saying what everybody knows about Donald Trump, but how he's being feted by the media. Evo Morales speaks to Indigenous activists in Canada, and a whole bunch more on the Michael Brooks Show. But first, let's talk about the radical legacy and ongoing relevance of liberation theology. Liberation theology broke from the historically conservative role of the church. Theologists in the United States and across Latin America, including Leonardo Boff and Matthew Fox, started to push back with a theology that not only centered the poor and was connected to Marxist currents, but also question theologically concepts like original sin that started to undermine the kind of punitive power of the church and reframed theology with this idea of an original blessing, which had significant implications for everything from forgiveness, redemption, people's spiritual lives, and also the rights and claims of viciously repressed and genocided against indigenous people. I think this is a very noble tradition, and I think it also has deep relevance as we sort of cascade in 2020 without much grounding. Liberation theology broke from that conservative role. In Brazil, it was involved in the fight against the dictatorship, the founding of the Workers' Party, supported the Sandinista movement and other movements across Latin America. It was pushed back against by the Vatican. Some, such as the liberation theologist Matthew Fox, who was actually literally pushed out of the church after being silenced for several years, he suggests, and some reporting suggests, that the CIA was closely involved in the Vatican, pulling support for liberation theology aligned priests in Latin America in the 70s and 80s as part of a deal and overlap of interests to support the solidarity movement in Poland and to sort of consolidate around reactionary forces in Latin America. Liberation theology is committed to fighting for the poor and the oppressed. It has a critique of capitalism. It has a concern for ecology as well as for women's rights. It also speaks very directly to so many of what things that we need to deal with now. We do need to build strong bonds of solidarity. We do need to build a healthy, sustainable, and renewable culture on the left. So much of the modern left online just spirals into endless waves of hysteria and toxicity, which undermine the very capacity to build a movement based on trust, durability, and the capacity to change inner and outer conditions. This sort of theology actually presents, even if you interpret it in secular terms, as I do, a very different way of looking at what the human project is, taking on humans and all of their complexity, and really building the actual spiritual and emotional foundations for the type of solidarity and serious, committed political work that we need. This runs into the face of the animizing, relentless march of separation, cruelty, and attacks on one another that sometimes might even come into the guise of systemic progress, but really only serve the needs of sort of short-term gain, social media platforms, and other representations of capitalism and atomization. When the Brazilian Frere Beto, who would later work in the Lula administration, was interrogated under Brazil's military dictatorship, he was asked by his captors why he called himself a Christian if Marx called religion the opiate of the masses. His response was this: "It is the bourgeoisie which turned religion into an opiate of the people by preaching a God, Lord of the heavens only, while taking possession of the earth for itself." This also reminds me, of course, of the great Bob Marley line about if you knew what life was worth, you would look for yours on earth. Not only is liberation theology committed to the fight for the poor, but it also has serious criticisms of the wealthy and the powerful. The countervailing forces of both the right-wing church repression by, among others, Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope John Paul, but also the rise of evangelicalism across Latin America has pushed back against this tendency. Radical and liberation social movements must be rooted in actually existing communities. Liberation theology shows a model of how existing social structures can be used to fight for a socialist future, even ones that have traditionally been dominated by conservative forces. Of course, there's an incredible Black liberation theology tradition in the United States, like the incredible Jeremiah Wright, who was demonized during Obama's run for the presidency, but whose prophetic voice still rings true in our politics, both in terms of racism and oppression inside the United States, as well as America's empire. My hero, Cornel West, also speaks clearly and rigorously to this in the relationship between people's own internal cultivation as well as its relationship to serious systemic political and economic change. Gustavo Gutierrez, one of the founders of liberation theology, said, "The use of the variety of tools does not mean sacrificing the depth of the analysis. The point is not to be simplistic, to insist on getting to the deepest causes of the situation. For this is what it means to be truly radical in every single sense: spiritual, psychological, political, and economic." You guys have any thoughts on my liberation theology kick?
Well, I mean, I really think that it's important to recognize how crucial this was, like in the social movements, and how organic it was. How social conditions can really reflect themselves in like our media, but also in like our spiritual beliefs. I think that thinking of like liberation theology in Latin America as sort of competing against like American style, the American style evangelical movement is really interesting, because in the United States we have this massive industry now. Obviously, like, you know, we've made fun of it and watched movies, TV shows like Righteous Gemstones, but, you know, people like Joel Osteen and those folks, they really reach out to a large, you know, population across the United States, and they preach essentially like American capitalist ideology. And they try to tie it to Christianity, but fundamentally, that's just as like reifying and reaffirming, you know, American ideology of like, okay, if you have a lot of money, you deserve it and it's good. Right. Liberation theology, on the other hand, was so powerful because it was able to take, you know, religion, which is very dear and important to a lot of people's social fabrics, and turn that into something radical. And I think that not only is there a lot of inspiration we can take from liberation, you know, theology and what it's accomplished, and also if you personally like are interested in like the spiritual lessons that you can gain from it, too. I think there's a larger lesson as well about like how like our social movements need to be interacting with, you know, the people in general, right? Is actually like being in those communities and having ideas emanating like from community organizations and community structures rather than coming from like the outside in, which I think a lot of people now think is the way that we're going to win. I don't think we're ever going to win that way. Actually, like what we need is to actually exist in communities to start to radicalize and become left wing if we want to have them, you know, have the bases necessary to enact the change that we want.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of our interview with Cornell and how like and the whole him going on Joe Rogan and that masterful rhetorical performance and how that is the skill set you need to cultivate. And it's also it brings to mind Reverend Barber. Like these are my favorite leftists now, and I'm a thoroughly secularized guy. But the way that they can speak to communities is like with that righteous register, I think that's where the money is basically. Or yeah.
I mean, I think it's an interesting balance because I think it's like, yes, for very practical reasons. And one of the reasons that I've always hesitated, particularly when you incorporate a global view, you know, there are secular and atheist traditions everywhere on earth. And of course, particularly in, you know, certain theological contexts, it's incredibly brave to reject religious belief and sort of necessitates a certain, you know, at least liberal radicalism, which I can have a lot of respect for, you know, in certain contexts, obviously. But, you know, in the main, if you're looking at global examples, religiosity is important to a lot of different people. And it manifests in a variety of different ways. I guess this also sort of overlaps with my, you know, on one hand, just my deep allergy to trying to control people's sort of, you know, I think in terms of how people live most of their lives, how they think, what they do, who they associate with, their sort of various personal opinions and, you know, behaviors on any number of things are really none of our business. None of, you know, we need to get back to that sort of real, genuine sort of openness about, you know, as an example, like people's religious beliefs, as long as it's not imposed, you know, on the state. And then the second thing is what we've been emphasizing, which is that you have to meet people where they are. There are all of these very left-wing iterations. I mean, there's also like socially engaged Buddhism as an example. There's different currents inside Islam. And so if you want to be in a global conversation, you can't discount these things. And third, I think to really strongly emphasize, you can process this in totally secular ways, but this is a moment with all of the alienation and fragmentation that people are in, and all of these, you know, pressing things that we're dealing with require, I would say, you know, politically, a very deeply and foundationally material analysis that really cuts through and sees things really clearly. And then conversely, infinitely more, frankly, patience and generosity and sort of sense of human beings in their totality. And, you know, a healthy spirituality, for lack of a better word, accounts for that and deals with that. And, you know, I don't like to get too sort of, you know, personal or whatever, but I could, you know, say as someone who, you know, deeply struggles with my own anxieties, you know, fears, guilt, whatever, all of these things that we struggle with, that having that like capacity for like both actual change that does arise from different types of internal work, which is really important. And then also the sense that, you know, people have capacity and people can grow, is really important, and something that should not be ceded, you know, least of all by the left. It's okay to be human. And it's okay to be complicated, and it's okay to change, and it's okay to have made mistakes, and it's okay to work every day to be better. This stuff is important, and it is actually connected to our politics in the broadest sense. And, you know, the courage that comes from that, and that's another thing when you read about these figures in liberation theology, to take but one of many examples, is very deep and abiding and much deeper than any kind of fad or moment.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to, you know, somebody who might be listening to this and you know, feeling a little cynical about what we're saying is like, look, you know, just from my personal experience growing up poor in the South in a very religious community, you know, lots of people who were, you know, they had the boot of like capitalism, and a lot of them had the boot of racism on their neck constantly. And you're able to escape into spirituality. And I grew up really being frustrated with that viewpoint, because what it did was it abstracted the actual conditions of, you know, their experience. So like, oh, I'm being abused by my boss, but you know what? I actually have a spiritual righteousness. So it's okay, even though I'll never achieve any, you know, I'll never be able to break from that in my life. You know, heaven will be my reward at the end of the day. Right. And I think that is where, you know, religion plays a role in like the capital system. But what Frei Beto says in the quote that she read, I think is exactly the kind of left-wing analysis that we can get out of like a Christian tradition as well, right? Where he says it's like, you know, you've basically said the poor can have heaven, but we're going to take earth, right? And they were rebelling against that idea. So like, I guess what I'm saying is like, I understand that criticism is something that's very true to me. And I get a little worried sometimes when I hear, you know, too much talk of like reintroducing like a religiosity, because you can see how it could be used, right? But these traditions like very much grapple with it. Cornel West said this very similar thing too when he was on the show. Was about Marx and like his resistance against like, you know, religion, because Cornel West is like, look what the church was doing at the time. I think it's like that kind of material analysis that was merged and developed in liberation theology is something that's very powerful.
It reminds me of Richard Slotkin, the mythology expert I'm always talking about. He talks about origin stories and compares the sort of Puritan story of creation to the Native American one, which there's different ones, obviously, but one of the main ones he specifies is Native American coming out of the sort of subterranean world or pre-world or whatever and killing a deer and feeding his, you know, family, whatever. And the Adam and Eve story is obviously don't go in there. That's private property, pretty much.
I mean, I think that's all, of course, you're both completely right. And I think one of the things that we get from, I mean, actually, even really the anti-essentialism work and Adolf Reed's work as an example is that we can start to also realize that these deeper narrative structures that say, like, let's just use this language. Let's just say, you know, base is where the real questions of economic relationship, hierarchy, class dynamics that are pushing the superstructure. Let's just be really crude about it, right? And say that relationship is totally linear and superstructure, whether it's, you know, culture, law, religion, whatever, is purely a manifestation of that. I think we all know that, you know, those dynamics are a little bit more permeable, but let's just say that. We can see that, you know, the superstructure will push out many different kinds of narratives to justify the exact kind of hierarchies that David's talking about. And a lot of them have been religious. But in today's world, they might be scientific. I mean, look at one of the most ugly books of the last couple of decades, right? Quote unquote scientific. You know, the bell curve, right? That one of the most ugly, this racist tract, this justification of a class hierarchy appealing to like America's obsession with, you know, quantifying unquantifiable things, right? But you can see, like, in a very broad sense, that these are all serving different functions for different classes at different times. And I think where I like to go generally is just, I mean, certainly I do have real sympathy for spirituality, obviously. But even beyond that, I think it's very interesting to look at, and Stuart Hall is an influence on this in some ways, is like, where does the population that is getting propagandized, let's say, or getting kind of filtered into a hegemonic project, they don't just accept that. They push back against it. They rework the patterns in their own terms. They fight. I mean, sometimes they absorb it, like in the depressing example you used, but in a lot of other ways, they take it and reassert it on its own, on its own terms. And so, speaking of religion, obviously we can see, innumerable examples where religion has also been used as a vehicle, basically for liberatory politics. So, and also the way in which, other paradigms, which we might think superficially are more like innately liberatory, are used to prop up those same capitalist dynamics just as easily, from like the worlds of science or, whatever else. So I think, the core question for all of these things are like, what are they serving and how, and, how they can be used. But of course, of course, religion has this history as well. There's no doubt about it.
Well, I was just saying, like, ideology is everywhere, and like we should be, combating with it on every terrain. Like that's like the Gramscian lesson.
Yes.
That, if every cultural product from astrology, to television, everything out there is like there's some form of ideology that's being pushed towards the population through that, and like we shouldn't just cede ground.
Are you sure we can't just?
That's what's occurring.
Are you sure we can't just deplatform it all?
Yeah, let's just deplatform.
Maybe astrology, but
no, that's like the last thing to go after.
That's the only thing.
I saw in the comments, and I want to echo, every time the bell curve has been brought up, I always should bring up the classic, The Mismeasure of Man by Stephen Jay Gould. Just what a beautiful book. Totally falsely maligned.
Yeah, if you identify as a leftist and as somebody who cares about science, it's like maybe the first book to read if you haven't yet.
Totally. It's a profoundly beautiful and important book. All right, let's do a brief pitch, and then we're going to have our first guest on, William Shaki. So guys, short and sweet. When you become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show, there's over 700 more episodes available. Deep histories on every single part of the world, theory explanators, and all of the fun that we have in the post game, including with great additional guests like Artesia Balthrop, Ben Burgess, Joshua Kahn Russell, Daniel Bestner. For 21 and above patrons, you have a brand new video illicit history, which is of the relationship between FDR, the New Deal, labor, A. Philip Randolph. It's brilliant. And we are still working steadily towards our goal to get to our first 4,000 patrons. So go get everything. Become a Patreon today, patreon.com/TMBS. Matt or David, I'm sorry, can we throw up TMBS.FM? Our store is restocked. We've got some new union-made T-shirts and long-sleeve shirts for sale. You can pre-order them now. TMBS.FM, and they'll be shipped in about 4 weeks. It's a lot of fun. You could just scroll down. That's the TMBS Worldwide. As an example, we've got TMBS Worldwide, white and black. We've got a Noku shirt and a Sankara shirt.
I need that Sankara.
The Sankara shirt is dope. And I should say that some of these, we're going to, with some of the proceeds, a little bit from these sales, but actually also because we were taking a little bit from overall last month to contribute to something. So the first group that we're going to give something to is the Wildfire Project, which is Joshua Kahn Russell. They're training and working with activists in the front lines of numerous incredible efforts, rent strikes, frontline rights of migration, and immigration rights. They're deeply involved, in different ways with the struggles right now against police violence and abuse and racism. And I, believe in what they're doing. We're working on it. We're going to talk with Milton Alamati. I'm not sure. There's going to be something small from the Sankara that will go to something to do with issues specifically related to Africa. Obviously, that's something very important to us on this show. And then we'll announce one or two others shortly. Not much, but just giving something to support everything moving along. Also, guys, really honored and happy that Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Answer to the New Right is selling really well. And I would still strongly encourage you to go to Red Emma's. Red Emma's is a worker cooperative owned store in Baltimore. It's awesome. It's exactly the type of thing we need to make sure survives the times of COVID and Great Depression, and which is really where we are in terms of job market loss.
The Great Depression is no longer a singular event anymore.
No, it's really not. And there are so many different dimensions of what we need to do, but I really do believe profoundly that economic arrangements outside of the tyranny of monopoly capitalism is hugely important. So, on a personal level, it's nothing more than symbolic, but just don't use Amazon to the extent you can't use it. And it's a very interesting experiment. I've actually been making that experiment, and I've pretty much actually have cut out basically all Amazon usage. Now, I'll say I'm not, I don't order a huge amount of things online or whatever, but, certainly order books for work. And, unless it's truly something I can't hunt down otherwise, I simply only use independent bookshops or something like Red Emma's, which even in addition to the importance of just kind of capital moving outside of monopoly, which is vitally important of itself, it's a workers' cooperative. So in addition to buying my book, let me just, which I hope you will do, and getting a lot of great feedback on it, and I think it's really useful for the moment. But, there's a lot of great books you can buy at Red Emma's, so let me just make it a pitch for them as well. All right, I guess we will welcome, we're not taking breaks, correct?
No breaks.
All right, no breaks. So William Shaki will join us directly.
It's transitioning now.
Oh, nice.
All right.
What is it?
There we go.
Joining us now on the Michael Brooks Show is William Shaki. He joins us from South Africa. He is a writer for Africa is a Country, which is an excellent site that everybody should be reading. William, thank you so much for doing this. How are you?
I'm okay. Thanks, Michael. Thank you very much for having me on the show. I'm a big fan, and it's an honor to be here today.
Oh, well, the feeling is really mutual from reading your work, and so it's a great honor to have you. You wrote this brilliant piece in Africa as a Country, which maybe we'll put up on screen, called The Class Character of Police Violence. The police violence and murder of Black people in the United States has provoked anger, outrage, and protests around the world, including on the continent. But why is there so little outrage over police violence in African countries? Now, what I would like you to do is start by talking about specifically South Africa. I noticed that President Cyril Ramaphosa, former President Thabo Mbeki, who are both, in addition to being South African leaders, are, icons of the freedom struggle in South Africa. They had some very inspiring and encouraging words about the uprisings that we're seeing in the United States and the Black Lives Matter movement. And, one part of me, there's really nothing I like more than that kind of grounded, real internationalism. I loved seeing Jerry Adams, on Falls Road, taking, having, the new mural of George Floyd and saying Black Lives Matter. On the other hand, it's very important that we actually achieve these things. And we do understand the kind of broader dynamics. So can you just tell us, South Africa was liberated in, basically in a process, I guess, between 1993 and 1994, and South Africa and the ANC has governed it since 1994, has governed South Africa. What is the state of policing in South Africa today? And what does it tell us about not only race in policing, but capital in policing?
That's a very good question, and I'll do my best to try and answer it comprehensively. So, the state of policing in South Africa at the moment is one where it exists as a body of brutal repression. So the everyday experience of working class South Africans who, till this day, are still geospatially located in informal settlements or townships, slums, or as many people around the rest of the world know them. The experience of these working class South Africans is one in which the police don't really exist as a service to protect their interests and to try and achieve safety for them, but rather as this disciplining force that tries to contain the discontent, which is always brewing in these conditions, because a lot of South Africans live in conditions of extreme poverty, joblessness, and hopelessness. So that's what the South African police force exists to do. And you can't understand South Africa's police force as it exists today separate from its political economy. So South Africa, in spite of achieving democracy in 1994, is still a highly unequal society, and that inequality follows a racial pattern. But the promises of the National Liberation Movement, which was led by the ANC, originally was to provide a period of socio-economic transformation. But in the 26 years since it's come into power, it's abysmally failed in providing for that. And it has largely remained committed to a path of neoliberal growth and development. And these neoliberal growth and development goals and sort of the fundamental character of the economy makes it such that the police has to exist as this force which tries to ward off against the adverse consequences of this unstable growth path, which means accumulation and growth for a select few and widespread poverty and dispossession and anguish for the majority of South Africans.
Can you talk, I guess then let's go through like the history of what happened with the ANC. What is the process by which I still would say probably the most iconic liberation movement in the world, and really at a time when there was Africa just had so many incredible leaders, so the ANC still stood out, and it was a party that had a alliance with the labor union movement, had an alliance with the South African Communist Party. What are the conditions through which they achieve liberation but give up on their economic goals? And let's just start with that. What is the history of that?
So the African National Congress is an interesting political formation because it doesn't really have any specific identity. So rather than viewing it as this social democratic party, which a lot of people are predisposed to viewing it as, I think it's better understood as being this broad tent formation and a revolutionary nationalist front whose main political goal and reason for being was to achieve emancipation for Black South Africans during the apartheid era. And so when it was unbanned in 1990, it had entered the South African political landscape after years of carrying out its work in exile, because most of its foremost political leaders were sent into prison in the 1960s, Nelson Mandela being the most famous of them, and had to carry out a lot of its activities in other countries and in clandestine ways. So when it enters the scene in 1990, it comes into a set of conditions which are pretty hostile. So there are adverse local conditions, which is to say that a lot of South African domestic capital is, and this capital at the time is still largely white, are unsure of the political trajectory that the country is going to follow. And it's entering a set of hostile international conditions, which is during a time when neoliberal globalization is strengthening and it emerges as the global consensus. So it arrives on the scene at the end of history. and in a lot of ways has to march with the path that history dictates. But I think at the same time, though, one thing about the ANC is that when it came into the scene then, it had underdeveloped its economic policy. So during the negotiation period between 1990 and 1994, it focused a lot of its attention on the political ideological project of nation building, of trying to unite these races which had previously been antagonistic to each other and existed in a relationship of hierarchy and subordination. And it neglected the questions of how to accomplish socioeconomic transformation. And I think that during that intense 4-year period, as much as a lot of people would portray it as being a situation where the ANC's hands were tied and it's effectively had to accept its marching orders from international finance institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, it did have glimpses of possibly pursuing an alternative path. So in 1991, for example, it developed the Macroeconomic Research Group, which produced this working paper called Making Democracy Work, which sort of recommended a neo-Keynesian redistributive growth path for South Africa. And in 1994, it formally adopted the Reconstruction and Development Plan, which was going to continue the spirit of social democratic redistribution. But because it had underdeveloped its economic policies, I think it left itself vulnerable to economic orthodoxy prevailing. And that's effectively what happened in that period, when it hadn't really given much attention to how it was going to implement a lot of these ambitions and effectively accepted what a lot of economically connected and elites were telling it to do at the time.
So then what is the parallel story with policing? Because again, it's like it seems like such a direct parallel because, okay, there's the military, the security forces, the police are an instrument of apartheid. They're the physical manifestation of racist terror of the apartheid regime. Then we go, and on one hand, I'm assuming, there's going to be changes at the top. There's going to be different types of representation. But then beyond that, what's happening? I mean, what in terms of changing the policies of the police, the issues, as you were talking about, in terms of policing the periphery related to it. And also, is South Africa a pioneer in kind of the rise of private policing services as well?
Yeah. So I think to answer that question, I think in the 1990s, there was a concerted effort to try and transform the character of policing. Obviously, policing in South Africa had, until then and until now, been the symbol of brutal repression. And the goal was to try and make it something that would be rendered as a public service. So the big symbolic change is that it moves from being the South African police force to the South African police service. And its main mission was, the hope would be, to provide public safety. But I think what the South African case demonstrates is how the goal of public safety provision runs up against the demands of capital and of maintaining the social and economic order. And I think this was the case even when explaining the rise of privatization in South Africa's policing and security forces, because the privatization turn really began in the 1970s after the June 16 uprisings in 1976. And when the government then of P.W. Botha decided that what should happen is, rather than sending in the troops and sending police forces into townships, a lot of these activities could be outsourced as a more politically palatable option, or at least that was the hope, what the perception would be. And so this privatization begins in the 1970s and carries on during the post-democratic era. Because, I mean, one thing that's definitive of South Africa's post-democratic era is an austerity budgeting mindset. So, the policing services have had their budgets cut. They don't receive much funding that capacitates them to do their work. And so people obviously start to view them as being incompetent and incapable and prefer to outsource the protection of private property to private entities.
So then talk about how you're viewing the Black Lives Matter uprisings of 2020 in South Africa. And I just want to put like a couple of ideas out because I specifically want to know your thoughts on them. So one, and there's one that's very pessimistic, and one that I would say is actually, and I hope is true because it's incredible, which your colleague Sean Jacobs, that Anna and I interviewed on weekends this past Saturday, which I recommend everybody go watch over on the Jacobin channel. But Alex Huckley is a really interesting piece in Damage, which again, I don't necessarily agree with all of it, but I think it's a great overall critique and a check on this idea that the replications of protests, particularly in Europe, it's really just an expression of kind of American soft power and branding. So you have places where, very specifically, let's just say so the police violence is actually targeted at very specifically, say, like the Roma population. And there isn't anything, like there's no rhetoric about the racism to do with Roma. There's no context of it. It's literally a replication of what you see in the United States. Is this very, and then, I think obviously in other places like the UK, it's much more complicated, but this is a very interesting critique and a very important one. And then, of course and then as soon as it spins off into the whole, white fragility book, it's like, oh God, is that going to get translated into Danish, Jesus, and all of a sudden the whole kind of just absolutely kind of embarrassing disaster of it all. On the flip side, Sean Jacobs, editor at Africa as a Country, has actually compared the 2014 uprisings and emergence of Black Lives Matter after the murder and events in Ferguson as one of obviously many, many, many examples, as in 1996 Soweto uprising. And now 4 years later, he actually compares it to the United Democratic Front, which was seminal in dismantling apartheid in the 1980s. I mean, that's an incredibly optimistic read of the possibility of this movement. And it seems to me, though, that the irony is that if Sean Jacobs' version is going to be right, we have to fight to make it right. America needs to get infinitely less insular, because the class dimension that you're pointing to could probably be best understood through South Africa. And it's not on the map as we shift to, Gone with the Wind is off TV, a new round of terrorizing people on Twitter, and all of a sudden, all of the, very serious dismantling racist, terroristic policing at the intersection of white supremacy and capital, falls to the background.
Yeah, I think Sean's comparison to the United Democratic Front is interesting, but I've expressed it to him that I'm skeptical of what's happening now and what happened with the United Democratic Front being analogous. And I think, the reason why I'm skeptical is that I think that the formation of the United Democratic Front emerged as a mobilization towards a very clear and definitive goal that had a precedent of long-standing mobilization, right, which was ending apartheid. And that's simple, and that's clear, and that's straightforward. Whereas I think the mobilization that's happening now, I think as much as it's starting to crystallize into very specific goals, such as defunding and democratizing the police, the vision for structural transformation is more unclear, right? In the 1980s, when the United Democratic Front was formed, the vision for structural transformation was extending political franchise to Black, colored, and Indian South Africans, right? But now, I think that the vision for structural transformation that the Black Lives Matter movement has to start naming and moving towards is one of the fundamental transformation of America's political economy, right? So it has to become anti-capitalist in orientation. And I think that's the direction that it has to go towards. And it's hard to tell at the moment whether or not that will be the case, and what does it hinge on for it to start to trot in that direction.
Do you feel a particular, because again, America is just, even when we're being, finally acknowledging the depth of racism in this country and sort of starting to adopt certain neoliberal or woke discourses or whatever, we are so damn insular. And I'm just curious, very specifically, when you think about the strategic orientation of where things can go, and including this kind of anti-capitalist and public goods framework, do you have a specific thought of a lesson for the United States when you take, again, leaders like Ramaphosa and Mbeki, that I will say from a US perspective, whatever damage they have caused in office or in Ramaphosa's business career, maybe you'll talk about Marikana. These guys are still just definitionally more impressive than almost anybody on the American political scene. Honestly, Zuma too. Honestly, these are people who have accomplished real things at enormous physical risk and produced a vital and necessary change that still inspires the world. And then actually not much with regards to the working, to the poor, to structural change, to uprooting all of the legacies of apartheid. And so, I just wonder if there's a way of, translating that to the relevant lesson here for the United States and the globe.
Yeah, I think for me, sort of like the case of Ramaphosa and Mbeki, I think can be instructive to the rest of the globe in demonstrating, I think, the pitfalls of, some strains of racial identity politics, right? Which is to say that I think that, you're right. And I have to give proper acknowledgement to the tremendous accomplishments of the African National Congress and the fact that it has delivered a lot of substantial gains for South Africa's poor. But having said that, I think that what we're witnessing in South Africa now is the discrediting of the national liberation movement, which is this idea that if you elect Black people to high political office, then they will be well placed to deliver political gains that translate to the lowest rungs of that society. And what Ramaphosa and Mbeki specifically, I think, embody is that national liberation current, and specifically one that, after the embrace of neoliberal orthodoxy, promoted this idea that all South Africa needs for socio-economic transformation is to encourage the emergence of a patriotic bourgeoisie, expand the Black middle class, and then this will deliver economic gains that trickle down to poor South Africans. And it's been demonstrably untrue. That hasn't happened. As much as, poor South Africans have access to important basic services, that's just been the absolute minimum provision for them. And this national liberation politics, which has sort of been the highest expression of South Africa's political imagination and ambitions, is proving an unstable and unworthy and illegitimate form of delivering socioeconomic transformation for the majority of South Africans. And I think that's probably how I think it could be instructive for the American case, which is to say that if we don't, and this is, I guess, what I was also trying to emphasize in my piece, is that if we don't emphasize how there are class distinctions between Black people as well, then you're going to get trapped once again in a political mode which posits the homogenous interests of Black people. And then when some Black people are able to be in positions of enormous power, you're going to be disappointed because you're going to discover that in fact there are contradictory interests, class interests within amongst Black people. And I think that's probably the most instructive the South African case is, or what it's most instructive of, rather.
Yeah, and again, this just leads us always back to Adolf Reed. So, and Vivek Chibber was talking about this too, like the just sort of the relentless middle classness of it all. And so do you see that sort of one-to-one of, the different polls that the rhetoric goes, like people are in the street because of racism, police violence, police fatal violence, and then how it overlaps with class, and then a conversation that goes to, we need to deal with that, and then we need to deal with the corresponding issues of capitalism, and then, you know, especially in mainstream discourses, it just completely turns to, you know, you see like the notification on the phones. And again, it's not a question, of course, yes, like, or obviously diversity in organizations and so on is important, but you can see the just kind of rapid change from any of the radical policy implications for policing and connected issues to the same, we'll have this ongoing brutal inequity, but we'll change some of the composition at the top.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the direction that I see it going in. And I think what I would say is that it presents a challenge for the American left, which is to say that I think that it was inevitable that this was going to be co-opted, and we shouldn't be surprised that it's being co-opted.
Right.
What the American left rather has to guard against is embracing some of the ways of understanding and explaining the problem, which is now starting to enter mainstream discourses and sort of pacify the radical potential of this movement. And I think that in order to do that, it continuously has to sort of emphasize the class dynamic and the class character of all of these issues, right? That just seems to me like a very obvious thing that it has to do. And it shouldn't.
And you got accused of distraction. I mean, this is how ridiculous the debate can get in the United States, because it's like, you have this incredible, and I wonder if there's parallels in South Africa too, where it's like, okay, so the only people that would, you know, all lives matter, whatever. Like, there's a big contingent of reactionary, racist, and, you know, politics in the United States. Okay, so set that. That's very clearly in political conflict. And then you, although even there, bizarrely on the superficial end, like, the Republicans and Donald Trump feel the need to fake police reform, you know, like, we're no more chokeholds. I mean, you know, unless your life is in danger. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. It's insulting. And they literally gas protesters at the same time. But you can move the cultural dial enough where even Mitch McConnell will pretend that he needs to pretend to care about, feel he needs to pretend to care about police brutality. And then but then in this conversation, it's like, okay, so this is happening. This is absolutely unacceptable, and it needs to be a site, you know, a launching point for all of these issues of class and distribution and race. And then it becomes, oh, well, you're distracting from it. And I'm just, and then it's fascinating because it sounds very like, wait, I certainly don't want to be distracting from it. But then it's like, wait a second, the conversation that sounds the most sort of like specific and radical all of a sudden is ricocheting into the same conversation that has to do with, you know, like CNN having more, you know, different executives or whatever, which again, sure, great, they should, but that's not what this is about.
Yeah, I mean, exactly that. And it's perplexing to me as to why it would ever be portrayed as a distraction, because if one thinks of a lot of what this movement seeks to accomplish, right? Defunding the police, democratizing the police, demilitarizing the police, and in the most radical iterations, abolishing the police in its entirety.
Right.
And there's a separate conversation about whether or not that is politically desirable or feasible or whatever. But if you think about what this movement hopes to accomplish, none of this is going to be possible unless you have a transformation of the fundamental political economy of the United States. And none of it is going to be possible unless you build political power that puts you in a position to have the capacity to implement all of this stuff in the first place, right?
Right.
And if the conversation enters that territory, then it becomes a matter of, how do we get there? How do we build a resilient movement that is able of implementing the things that we want? And if you're on the left, the way you build that movement is by waging class struggle. So it's I don't know, it's perplexing, as I said, to me, to to see why amongst the left this would be viewed as a distraction, when I understand that as being the definitive quality of being on the left, or at least I guess the socialist left. And maybe the left is become something that is much more expansive of different political tendencies than it once was. But that's my understanding of it. Yeah.
No, I think that's perfectly put. Well, first of all, I hope you will come back on much more frequently if you can. And I really appreciate you staying up for us. But as a final question, what's the situation in South Africa? Are there countervailing forces emerging, electoral or otherwise, in the South African context?
So the South African political landscape is complicated for a lot of reasons. And it's basically a kind of, like the South African left has been moribund for a really long time. I think the reason that's the case is because the biggest sort of working class organizations, the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions, as you've mentioned, have been hitched to the ANC through the tripartite alliance and are no longer rooted in actual working class expression and activity. So it's now a matter of there really is no visible and strong left that exists in South Africa. It's scattered across different social movements, or it is following sort of the economic freedom fighters, which is this political party which claims to be left, but it's really this kind of economic nationalist formation that is trying to sort of entrench some kind of indigenous capitalism in South Africa and wrestle control of the economy away from international finance capital and white capital. So the South African political context is very complicated and difficult. And what's interesting about the South African political context, and this is where I think Alex's piece is interesting, is that in sort of like the media landscape, it still adopts a lot of the American frameworks and tools of understanding our political situation, which I think often just lead to confusion and obfuscation of the real problems that we are facing. And I agree that, the one advantage that I think the South African left has, which can make us a little bit more bold in our assertion that class is central to the struggles that we wage, is that being a majority Black country, it's obvious that the people who will disproportionately benefit from redistributive programs are Black South Africans. And I think that the task for the South African left today is to just return to those class politics and to try and assert them bravely and without fear and with devotion. And remains to be seen how that happens and if that happens.
Well, that's really perfectly put. Please stop taking American frameworks. I would like us to be importing frameworks, and our frameworks don't explain ourselves, let alone South Africa. And I think it's true in the United States. And another one of these kind of incredible ironies that if we have that three options where it's like, okay, let's have white identitarian, reactionary based capitalism, which makes sure that fits with the history of discrimination in this country and fits those things together. Okay, well, obviously anybody liberal or left rejects and fights against that. And then this, the neoliberal, it's fine. We can have mass immiseration and whatever, but we need to have 12% of the 1% needs to be African American and whatever. The incredible irony is that a properly working class movement in this country, and I know that everybody knows what I'm going to say, but it's like, because of the history of how we've racialized capitalism in this country, and also just because of the many, not the few, would actually necessarily be, in terms of leadership and composition, infinitely more substantively diverse across every sector than what this sort of like neoliberal pivot is showing. So it's the incredible, that's a way in which South Africa, because the class dynamics are more stark and you actually do have a liberation party in government, maybe it's a little bit more complicated. But in the United States, it's like, if you had a proper mass-based class politics would be the greatest ushering in of substantive leadership diversity this country's ever seen, and infinitely more than what anybody else is putting on the table. It's another kind of, and would be, I mean, it would be so beneficial because of the diversity along race and gender. It would also have a class background diversity, which we never discuss. So it's incredible the knots that our liberal classes have twisted us in to not get to even the substantive realization of the goals that they're constantly banging on about. But
I guess, I mean, my question to you, I mean, like, what's I haven't been paying as much attention. I mean, I've been embracing this idea not to embrace American frameworks. I haven't been paying much attention to sort of the trajectory of the protests so far. I mean, in what direction do you think it's going?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I actually think the distinction that I would draw is that I think the real, democratize, defund, demilitarize, that is very hard and very far off. Although this is tricky because I don't want to kind of it's like the thing with Bernie. Like, Bernie did change the conversation. How important is that? How sustainable is that? I don't know. So the conversation has absolutely been changed on policing. And that's because of people physically risking their lives. And it's also had these incredible anomalies that are amazing. Like 53% of Americans thought it was cool that the police precinct where the murderers of George Floyd were was burned down. Okay, that's cool, And then absolutely, we are rushing to co-optation, to HR politics. It's also, I think, without Bernie being here, it's setting off another wave of just disgusting online toxicity and these just utterly embarrassing toxic games people play here. And, these obsession with personality and destruction. It couldn't be more sick and awful. I think actually in the middle of all of that, which is less sort of trendy, but I actually think is quite important, is there is a politics that I would say flows from the 60s that is really just like substantive liberalism and is actually really quite important. And it's not, it is not going to get to the class dynamics that overall, of course, need to get incorporated in if you want to really, do something radical with policing. But it's also not all of this kind of woke class politics and online trash. It really is actually, the substantive pushback on what has been a reversal pretty much as soon as the civil rights era, acts were passed, like the assaults on the Voting Rights Act and things like that. So I think there's actually some people involved who are looking very specifically at substantive legal reforms, which are and potential budget cuts, which are really, really important. And so I think Shama Sawant is actually an incredible instrument of this. And it's very interesting because she criticized Minneapolis. She said, whatever, you disband it, but you're going to study it for a year and it will just go away, and maybe I don't know, maybe she's not being charitable, but it's very interesting to me that partially because she's only one person on the council, so there hasn't been big headlines, but this is one person who's saying like, no, you're not, like, tear gas is done. And even things like community oversight, which people have objected to me talking about in the past. Toothless community oversight is toothless community oversight, but substantive, actual democratic power over there's a reason there was a cop riot against David Dinkins in 1992 when he tried to do that. Like a literal cop riot, not like the ones we've seen the last couple of weeks where they've been terrorizing protesters. They themselves were actually rioting. So I think those are sort of the three directions. I think some people are definitely getting radicalized and there's a fuller expression, and that's down to the grassroots. Then there's definitely a new proliferation. We're back to all of this trash woke politics, which is just awful across the board. And then I actually think very in the middle that is not getting enough attention is really just even what the Democrats put forward, it's totally insufficient in terms of the overall picture. But some of it is like, yeah, these are actually, there's some solid small reforms that should have been done decades ago. So that's kind of how I see it.
I think what's interesting, I mean, to sort of come back to the South African case, we think of how do we try and reform policing in South Africa. I think it's very clear in the South African context that we're not going to we can't push for a defund the police demand because our police forces are already being defunded through austerity. And a lot of, something that I say to a lot of my fellow South African comrades, just given how, incompetent and corrupt our police forces are, is that a lot of the modest reforms that are being proposed in America would go miles in South Africa. And that really, something that I try to push in the circles where I have some modest influences to say that, a lot of people are trying to embrace the American rhetoric of defunding and disbanding and abolishing the police. And I think a much more effective strategy would be to sort of emphasize the provision of the social programs, which would guard against crime and disorder proliferating in the first instance. And to me, that strikes me as a much more viable path when it comes to trying to persuade people to what you're in support of. And I think that a lot of what I'm seeing now in terms of defunding the police is drawing attention to that by saying we need to think about how budgets are allocated. But I think that you can talk about emphasizing the provision of the social programs, and that's more appealing. And then answer the how will we pay for it question by saying, well, we pay for it by defunding the police.
Yeah, I think that that's also true because even, the way when those cuts start getting talked about, and I'm very concerned that if you don't immediately frontline, like you're going to cut this police department in half, and we know exactly to the line where it's going in terms of education and healthcare and so on. If it doesn't do that, then it will just evaporate into more austerity, which they want anyways. I think you're totally right about that.
It's to say something else about this. One thing that I think I wouldn't say worrying, but it's concerning that the Bernie campaign kind of ended very recently, and it feels like it's been relegated into the far corners of people's consciousness. And I think that this is a fertile moment to connect what Bernie was proposing to what everyone is starting to propose now.
I agree with you completely. And unfortunately, there's the liberal contingent that see this as some type of repudiation of Bernie, which it's very much not. The other difficulty again is just in the types of things that get conflated, like another thing that comes up is the very, I think, just obvious and sensible that, the idea that police are deployed when somebody's having like a mental health issue or something is ridiculous. And that's a reform that can be immediately changed. Or, and also the paradox we've talked about on this show, which is not, it's not in line with the sort of trendy rhetoric, but something that definitely emerges from opinion polls and actually sort of reporting thing, which is like the paradox of neighborhoods that are the most deep and systemic victims of racism and class-based harassment and ongoing broken windows policing and just absolutely terrorizing people for drinking a beer where that would be completely ignored in a predominantly white middle-class neighborhood. This is happening all over the country, and so this is a basis upon which people are uprising along with the murders. And then at the same time, when you dig into this, that paradox that actually, well, there's other areas where we feel like you're not taking murder or rape actually seriously, like you're not actually looking into these things. It reminds me of President Lula was confronted on, some crime statistics going up when he was president. And he had this he said, that's ridiculous. The difference was that we counted crimes that occurred in the periphery. So this was always happening, but we were going to document that if somebody got murdered in a favela, that mattered, that needed to be investigated, that needed to be noted. So I think that there's a lot of, and then there's a whole other question about punishment and so on, which I think is also, again, an extremely important one that maybe could get disaggregated between policing and prisons. Like, because to me, like, the function of policing, I don't see how, even if you call it something different, there'll be a function like that. But prisons, it's interesting because maybe it's like, look, there might be always a function of keeping somebody who is literally unsafe to other people sort of away. But the idea of, just this like function of punishment being interrogated, punishment for punishment's sake. I mean, I think that needs to be deeply interrogated. I would probably have a pretty close to abolished position on that. And they're part of the same continuum, obviously, in terms of racism and class and the revanchism of the suburbs. But in some ways, to me, practically, they start to actually pose very different questions in terms of like the renaming and reframing and change of things.
That's exactly right. Yeah, absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah.
William, will you come on again soon, brother?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot to unpack, but this is a great conversation.
I'd be absolutely happy to come back on. Thank you so much for having me.
I really appreciate your time. And please, everybody, read Africa as a Country. It's a fantastic, really, really good site on not only politics. You guys actually have extensive film, sport, art coverage. It's just an excellent website. William, I thank you so much. Stay safe and well.
Thanks very much, Michael. You too.
Take care.
Cheers.
Cheers. All right, Matt and David, are you there?
Yep.
I guess we have, you can hop off, William. It's so awkward without the break, man.
I know.
I always feel like such a dick too, because it's like you have this like really nice rapport with somebody, like, yeah. But anyways, wow, this is a deep show. And we're gonna, because we're not even gonna play Ronan in the post game. We're gonna play this on the main show too. So you guys are feasting here. Go become a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. You are definitely not getting conversations like this anywhere else, and you're also not getting the gem anywhere else. David, what do we got?
Yeah, well, so basically, we're seeing a big shift in a major conversation. There's been a reopening that's been happening in a very bizarre, anarchic way all across the country. But as these next few months go on, we're going to start to see this play out to be more of a dynamic for people across the economic spectrum across the country. And I really wanted to talk about basically like choice and the labor relations that go into, choices over your own safety. And specifically, I want to focus on essential employees, which the EPI estimates that there are around 55 million people who have been deemed essential during this period of time. And it's hard to get full information on these groups, but like the EPI is estimating that around half of the essential industries have a median hourly wage that is less than the non-essential workforce's median hourly wage. So the people who basically have been asked to go forward and put their lives at the risk and the lives of their family and their communities and people around them, they're getting significantly less amounts of money than people who are working in these other industries. So right now we're starting to see what the cost of that is, and we've been seeing that for a long time. Last week we talked about what's happening with all the poultry workers in this country who have been severely exposed to this virus. But I wanted to talk sort of about, move away from like the numbers per se and a little bit more about how people are sort of feeling about the work that they're being asked to do. So the National Employment Law Project, they asked workers, and this information was broken down by income, workers who have been deemed essential. They asked them, have you gone to work outside your home during this pandemic, even though you thought it might be seriously risking your health or a family member's health? And for workers who are making less than $30,000 a year, 63% of them said yes. For workers in between the 30,000 and the 75,000 range, it was around 58%. And for those above the 75,000 range, it was 39%. So, the fact is that anybody who's going out and working under these conditions is, there are significant amounts of the communities that are feeling unsafe, but you can see how much greater that is on the share, of workers who are making significantly less. And, it gets even worse when you realize that, a significant amount of workers aren't getting any hazard pay. So out of those respondents to that survey, only around 30% of them said that they are getting, who are working outside their home, reported that they were getting extra hazard pay. So that's 70% of, the workers who have been basically facing this brunt of coronavirus, who haven't been getting any extra pay. And, there's the first dynamic, which is that like low wage workers have less access to healthcare because they don't have insurance or their insurance is bad. And two, how these things start to trickle out. So, people with lower incomes, they tend to live, a decent amount of them live in larger households. They tend to rely more on, their community. So the risk of, spreading the virus around your community is very large. And it's been very frightening to see as more and more people have basically been pushed into, the workforce against their will for the most part, by these states that have forced them in, into work, that we're starting to see the spread. So I'm just going to pull up this tweet right here from Christian Stefani that says that basically in Dallas, and Texas has been really getting hit hard over the past few weeks since they reopened foolishly. I mean, the governor of Texas, Abbott, just said that he finds the increase to be unacceptable, even though he's the one who's put in these ridiculous measures in the first place. So anyways, in Dallas, 80% of the new cases are frontline essential workers. And, this isn't an isolated event. I know across Texas right now, we're seeing an alarming rate of infections around people who are childcare workers and basically people who've been forced, back into work because other people are being forced into work, right? So now you have a larger, need and stress on, childcare, facilities in the state, and that's going on everywhere. So like the reality is that, these low wage essential workers are they're already being exploited, right? The fact that they're being paid less, even before this pandemic, that they were being paid less than what was deemed non-essential work should tell you, a great lesson about capitalism is that the people who are the most critical to the system are the ones who are the most exploited. And that's because, capitalism is a system that preys upon exploiting people and making them so desperate. The reality that so many people who are making less than $30,000 a year said that they had to work, even though that they really felt that they were putting themselves or their families at risk, shows a fundamental reality of capitalism. Capitalism is an authoritarian system that does not allow people to have the freedom of choice over their own bodies and over their own, community, because we are put into a situation where if you're not going into work, if you're not going in to be exploited by the market constantly, then you don't eat, you don't have a roof over your head, all these kind of things. And look, the reality is we're dealing with this pandemic and there is work that needs to be done. We're not denying that reality. But the fact is that the workers, these frontline workers who are so exposed to the virus, are one, they're dealing with employers who for the most part have been shown that they don't really care about their employees. They have not put in the kind of protections on the workplace that workers need to prevent the spread of the virus. You see a lot of employers being very timid, for example, when you have these lunatics running around in your store, refusing to wear masks. They're not standing up for their employees, right? That's a power dynamic, right? There's a moral question there. Like if you're a small business owner and you're not taking care of your employees, yes, that's a moral question, but it's fundamentally a power dynamic that working people aren't given the freedom in this country to demand and create safe environments to work during this pandemic. That fundamentally needs to change. And as we see other areas of the economy start to open up in the next few weeks, more and more people are going to experience this really callous relationship between the employer and the employee, when capitalists are basically going to make the decision that it's not very profitable, to put in the kind of protections that workers need to prevent the spread of the virus. You're going to start to see that dynamic, play out more and more. So going forward, I mean, like Tyson Chicken was a great example, right? It's like all these workers were demanding, like, if we just slowed down production a little bit, we could still meet, the demand for meat in the society. But Tyson was refusing
to even cut down a little bit on production. Because why? Because their only goal is to profit as much as possible. So these frontline essential workers, they need much more than just, our praise. They actually need like a genuine solidarity, and a solidarity that I hope more and more people start to become aware of, that all of us, the vast majority of the population in this country, are in the same relationship when it comes to our relationship between the bosses and the workers. And bosses all across this society are being able to make almost unilaterally decisions that affect massive amounts of people, massive, huge communities. They're making these decisions based on their own personal motivation to profit as much as possible. And that's no way to run a society. We're seeing its failures, specifically in the United States, when it comes to like our horrible hyper-capitalist system that really has completely failed at stopping this virus from spreading in the first place. And we're going to see it continue to get worse until there starts to be a pushback from the workers who are basically being sacrificed at the altar of like American profit. So I just really wanted to hit that right now, because it's starting to get very worrying for a lot of people that I've been talking to, people who already have been essential workers, a lot of people who've been working in the food service industry. There really is such a lack of care from their employers, lack of communication, and a lack of democratic decision-making. I think the framing of power is really important, that it is not right that a few people in the society are able to make these decisions that negatively affect so many people. And we need to be fighting back as much as possible against it, because it's not going to get better until we change that relationship.
Absolutely. Without a doubt. All right, folks, what we got now, how long is this interview?
It's 39 minutes.
All right, so we're going to play this interview with Ronan Burtenshaw. He's the editor of the Tribune, which is a great UK publication. I'd strongly recommend, if you can, you subscribe, at the very least, make it a part of your regular reading diet. This was really good and definitely echoes some of the themes we hit with William. We're going to play this interview, and then we're going to see patrons in the postgame, patreon.com/TMBS. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is friend of the show, Ronan Burtenshaw. He is the editor of Tribune Magazine. Ronan, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
So, Ronan, we're sort of taking in the last 10 years this wave of what looked like some pretty significant opportunities, from Syriza to Bernie Sanders. We're in a moment now, in no way, these ongoing Black Lives Matter demonstrations in the United States and internationally are obviously focusing on enormously important issues. We'll see which way they go, whether we're taking on serious substantive reforms, or is just sort of, the corporate diversion into kind of HR politics. We'll see. But that being said, outside of that, we've seen a kind of string of defeats for this sort of modern resurgence of social democracy in the kind of Western zone.
Yeah, look, my understanding of this last 10 years was that it was the beginning of a long cycle. If you think of what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s, the tide really went a very long way out. And we're not just talking about the defeats that were suffered, the neoliberal victory, the defeat of social democracy, the fall of the communist states, and so on, all of which had deep and profound impacts on the left. But it was the fact that on our own side, the horizon, the political horizon, was limited. So the Third Way Project, it was called Clinton in the United States, or Blair in Britain, or Schroeder in Germany. It was all about making the left buy into the fundamentals of the neoliberal settlement, the idea that the economy would continue to be run by the market, that basically we would have to give over the fundamental decisions of our society to the capitalist class. And the role of the left was only to mitigate that, to do a little bit of redistribution, to maybe redistribute some of the growth more towards working people than would be the case under a right-wing government. And so that massively limited the political imagination.
Did we lose audio, or is that just my internet? I'm sorry. Michael, can you hear that? maybe retry it or keep playing. Sorry.
A whole generation, and in many respects it's the generation that now are backing centrist figures, are backing Starmer in the Labour Party, are backing Biden against Bernie Sanders in the United States. These people who when faced with enormous political changes around them still have incredibly limited political imaginations about what is possible, and therefore act as a kind of as a rear guard for the status quo in political and economic terms. And so, that was the generation produced by the 80s and the 90s. The tide went a huge way out. And then with the 2008 crash, that whole moment of history, what, of course, Fukuyama in that cliched way called the end of history, it itself came to an end. And we got a new political moment opened up by the failure of the economic model produced by Thatcherism, Reaganism, the finance-led growth model, which was so structuring to the entire Western economy for decades, collapsed in itself in 2008, and it produced new openings, new spaces for alternative movements, for anti-system movements, anti-establishment movements, and for a renewed left-wing project in very many countries. And for the last decade, we've been kind of living in the space that 2008, 9, 10 opened up for us.
And what do you think the main factors are in sort of the reversal of this push? And let me just stipulate that obviously there's huge structural barriers. I mean, you cannot understand what happened to Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn without understanding the just vicious war that was waged against them by both, in both cases, the media and the party sort of apparatus, particularly of the Labour Party, but certainly, I mean, I think we would have seen a very similar dynamic if Bernie had actually earned the nomination in terms of people with actual leadership positions actively undermining the campaign of their party. So, and then of course in Syriza, the whole European architecture is coming down on them. But that being said, I mean, we do need to discuss those things, and we should, because those are, the main sorts of action in terms of what we need to overcome. But what was within, you think, the control of these movements and these parties and these leaders that they didn't take advantage of, or they didn't respond to strategically?
I think it comes down to the fact that we started from such a low point. And in each and every country, there were different responses to how to overcome the limitations of the left. But you have to understand that we started from a period of extremely weak trade union movements, in many cases, weak or barely existing socialist political parties. And then ideologically, we had lost enormous battles through the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, which figures like Bernie and Corbyn were only beginning to turn around. They were only beginning to plant the seeds of a different kind of ideological perspective. So we all started from a very, very low point. It's not to forgive us our sins of recent years, and things could have ended up better. But it's worth, I think, going through and remembering what we started with. So, you come in 2010, really, and you get these moments of the troika in Europe and the imposition of austerity and the start of kind of popular sentiment against that. In 2011, you've got the movements of the squares, the Indignados in Spain, St. Thomas Square in Greece. You've got Occupy Wall Street in the United States. And that whole kind of political moment was built on the detritus of the alter-globalization movements, which were, what the left could produce in the extremely fallow years of the 90s and early 2000s. They had some strengths, but they had enormous weaknesses. Those of you who were involved in Occupy in the US will know all about this. The emphasis on horizontal on decision being made by consensus, and probably crucially the anti-politics orientation. This idea that we're neither left nor right, we're not going to be involved in political parties, we're not going to be involved in the political system, we're going to be completely outside of all this, some kind of pure space that doesn't involve itself in any of the real dilemmas of political action. And those were extraordinary weaknesses, and those were the dominant ideological positions of the left at the beginning of this whole cycle. So to think we came from there to where we ended up, from like very marginal ideas where socialism, if you mentioned it in the 2010, 11, 12, was just off the map completely. It's when I got into the left, and it was extremely small space to call yourself a socialist and be taken at all remotely seriously, to the point at the end of the decade where we've got major, viable figures to lead some of the biggest capitalist states in the world who define themselves as socialists and who lead movements of people who are calling themselves socialists, and crucially we're representing a program within the electoral political sphere. But on the ideological question, it's worth saying as well that different movements within the last decade came up with different ways of adjusting to the challenges that we faced. The first big one to break through was in 2 elections in 2012 was Syriza. Syriza grew in the May 2012 elections, and then in the June ones, he shot up again. It came from a party of about 5 or 6% to one of 22, 23%, and all of a sudden it became a viable vehicle for taking political power through the electoral route. And that did 2 things. One, it sent all this generation who'd been radicalized by the movements of the squares, Occupy, or whatever else, towards left-wing politics and the idea that you could do something through the radical left. And it also opened up the question of, electoralism and what are we going to do about elections after such a long time when they were considered to be just not useful for the left. But Syriza came from a very specific formation. It was a new left party. It attempted to be a party of the movements. You could see it in its flag where it had the red, the purple, the green. It was again coming out of some of that kind of early 2000s idea of, well, how do we produce a viable left? We simply stitch together all the existing movements without necessarily anything cohering them in terms of an ideological position, certainly not in terms of the centrality of class politics or anything like that, but we're just going to try and stitch together all these movements. And on the one hand, for Syriza, that was a success because it produced a vehicle that could catapult itself towards power very quickly. But once it was in power, we saw the limits, that it was an incoherent project which had not asked itself enough about the structural limitations that it was going to face in the state, against capital, against the European Union, that it had been too much a kind of temporary and conditional alliance of different social forces and too little a worked out political project aiming at taking state power. So that was an example of one of the movements that achieved something, because a series out of all of these movements actually won an election and managed to govern and did it for a period of time from a relatively left position, would collapse within 6 months. And that's an indication of why, because it started from an incredibly low base, like all of the left in the West.
Yeah, and this actually sort of loops to a kind of an interesting balance that we have to strike that always emerges in these conversations. So one part, one tendency, which in a funny way can apply from everything to Syriza to I think, even some of the kind of, frankly, apologetics around China are just, it's all contextual. What could you possibly do inside the political environment as it's given? And therefore, every single either, capitulation or even sort of, generation of a governing model that we wouldn't even aspire to has to be explained in those kind of defensive terms. And then, of course, the other extreme is just the classic, it's like everybody, anytime I do some content on Brazil or something, there's always the person that pops up to remind me that, Lula was a neoliberal, whatever that even means, just these kind of, that everything is a question of willpower. Allende could have resisted the CIA and Pinochet if he only sort of, wanted it more. It's kind of weird, kind of left mix of this kind of incredible fantasy idealism, but actually also very like almost kind of like power of magical thinking, you know, almost like if you just wanted it more, it would happen, and the kind of ideals could transcend material circumstances. And so what is the middle position here? How do we actually track this out so that we all of a sudden don't go from, you know, understanding that Syriza was really pressed, they didn't have a proper strategy, there wasn't much room they had. And then on the other hand, it is really true that Syriza by the end of their tenure was more aggressively implementing austerity than, you know, some of its sort of mainstream political competitors.
Well, you're always, when you're engaged in left-wing politics, you're always picking up some of what's left around you. Like, this is the truth, because we don't set the terrain. But I think in the past decade, what we can see is that we did too little to try to at least shape that terrain around the electoral struggles. So the move towards elections and away from the extreme marginality that the far left was in at the start of this decade was really valuable. And we should be, you know, we shouldn't be delusional about that. We went from a period where, you know, our ideas were in rooms of 10 and 20 and 30 people with barely any engagement amongst the class with a mass audience, to one where millions of people were engaging with our ideas, saw our movements as to some degree representing their aspirations as working class people, and were prepared to throw their lot in with us to some degree, whether it was, you know, total loyalty or involvement or whatever. It was at least to support the policies and the programs and so forth that were being put forward by the left. So this was, in many ways, this last decade, there are things for us to take from it. But equally, we've got to see where mistakes were made. And again, I think it's worth comparing different kind of projects here. So we talked about, you know, Syriza as a new left formation and whatever. Well, another of the formations that came up with the silver bullet answer for the left in the last decade was Podemos. And Podemos were the kind of big thing for a period of time. And I have great respect for an awful lot of people who were involved in it, because in many ways it was an innovative project. And some of the things that Podemos did, I think, are worth learning from. But the ideological basis of Podemos was a populism that oriented away from class politics. So what Podemos were willing to accept or pick up from the terrain that was lying around was the idea that fundamentally politics was no longer about class, that it was something that operated at a discursive level, that all political questions were being formed up above by a mediatic sphere, and that there was no like underlying class tensions in society that were, you know, the fundamental structural influences. And on the one hand, Podemos produced these great innovations. They talked about La Casta, they talked about the regime. They produced these terms that were like popularized. They were not Marxist terms, but they were Marxish terms, right? To talk about politics that were popularized in Spanish society, and that then, you know, gave them an audience and a space that was much greater than the left had before. But you saw the real limitations in their political strategy, because unless you have an understanding of capitalism and class that is quite deep, you'll always end up in the tactics and never in the strategy. You'll always end up making these kind of small maneuvers from on top. So I do think that actually the last half of this decade, the Corbyn and Sanders experiments were the ones that we take most from, because in many ways they were the return to some of the other questions of the left, the older positions, not only in terms of, you know, running within the Labour Party or the Democratic Party or whatever, but actually in terms of trying to build off the basis of older school left-wing social democratic ideas with the centrality of class politics, and with an idea that you did need this broader context. Obviously, Bernie talked about the political revolution, but he was also quite clear about unions, and Corbyn obviously was integrally involved with left-wing trade unions. Now, both of those projects, what they did in a very important way was they had a class politics, but they had a mass orientation. So they were trying to take the left away from thinking and talking about the left and towards thinking and talking about, society as a whole and engaging in politics in a way that would be relevant to people's day-to-day lives. And both of them failed ultimately in those tasks, in part because even though the turn towards elections is right and is good and something we have to be, we can't now discard that and say, oh, that whole experience was a failure. No, we still need people in the institutions. But one thing we've definitely learned is that it is not possible to shortcut this. This attempt to kind of reverse engineer socialism by getting people elected who would just like shoot up through the ranks, win an election, and then all of a sudden be able to do it all from above was never going to happen. The truth of it was, we found out, but you're talking about the media, like this is one great example. We didn't build our own left media institutions. We didn't get our people into the media institutions, and therefore the media could destroy us. We didn't do the work of producing more effective socialist institutions and organizations on our own terms, and therefore the existing parties, the Labour Party, the Democratic Party, could destroy us. We didn't do the work of rebuilding the trade union movements in a way that made them a force in society that could reshape the political terrain and put things a little bit more in our favor, and therefore capital was able to shape things in a way that eventually broke and destroyed our projects. So I think what we can say is that you have to pick up some of what's lying around if you're trying to build a political project. There's no point, as you say, in engaging in like total voluntarism, thinking just by your force of your will, you can create a political project that doesn't relate to the world. No, you've got to pick up some of what's there, but you've also got to try and shape the terrain. That elections by themselves are not going to produce the silver bullet solution, but that mass orientation that elections force on you, the discipline of having to put your ideas and your program before the people and have it tested in front of the people, is something the left cannot afford to discard. Because I think when you look at the demoralization around now, you can easily see how everyone would respond to the kind of siren song of people on the left who are saying, well, let's go back to just talking to the left. Let's go back to just those small rooms that we were in a few years ago, the comfort zone. We can't allow ourselves to do that because we'll be setting ourselves back years and not a decade.
Yeah. Okay, folks. We're going to actually play the rest of that interview in the post game because we're running just a little bit long here, getting a little bit more sort of disciplined with the time. And we're also just recognize that in the main show, we give that there's so much to sort of process in terms of information. So we're just kind of pacing it a little bit. There's a whole second half of what Ronan and I got into. I'm sure we'll probably unlock it later. But for now, we'll play the second half of it in the post game. We've also, of course, got a debunk with the great Ben Burgess and a bunch of other stories to get to. So we will see you on the post game. Go to patreon.com/TMBS. If you're watching this, we appreciate all of you. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. And we'll see you guys in the post game in about 10, 15 minutes.